Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. Before modern drugs, before nightclubs and neon lights, people were already chasing altered states of mind. But what did getting high actually mean in medieval times? When science was limited, religion was powerful, and medicine was closer to magic than chemistry. Tonight, we're stepping back into a world where monks brewed mind-bending potions, warriors chewed strange plants before battle, and ordinary people unknowingly consumed substances that blurred reality itself. This is the forgotten history of what getting high was really like in medieval times. When we imagine medieval life, we often picture a harsh, gray world, muddy streets, cold stone houses, and people struggling just to survive. It's easy to assume that pleasure, escape, or altered states of mind simply didn't exist back then. No clubs. No pills. No syringes. No modern drugs. But that assumption couldn't be further from the truth. Medieval people lived in a world where intoxication was woven quietly, deeply, and constantly into everyday life. They just didn't call it getting high. To understand this, we have to forget everything modern culture tells us about drugs and alcohol. In the Middle Ages, there was no sharp line between medicine, food, religion, and recreation. A substance that made you feel different wasn't suspicious, it was useful. If it dulled pain, lifted the spirit, calmed fear, or helped you sleep, it was seen as a gift from nature or God. Daily life itself almost demanded some form of escape. Most people worked from sunrise to sunset. Disease was everywhere. Pain relief was limited. Death was common, sudden, and often brutal. In that kind of world, anything that softened reality, even slightly, was welcomed. Alcohol was the foundation of medieval intoxication, but not in the way we imagine today. Clean drinking water was rare. Rivers were polluted. Wells were unreliable. Fermentation made liquids safer to consume, so beer and ale became everyday staples, not luxury items. Men, women, children, even monks, drank them daily. But medieval beer was unpredictable. There were no standard recipes, no alcohol percentages printed on labels. One batch might be weak and watery, another dangerously strong. Brewers added whatever was available: grains, herbs, roots, flowers, even tree bark. Some of these additives had powerful psychoactive effects, though no one understood why. People didn't drink to party. They drank to survive. Yet survival drinking still altered the mind. Mild intoxication was constant, normal, and socially accepted. Being slightly buzzed wasn't a special occasion, it was everyday consciousness. And then there was ale. Unlike modern beer, medieval ale often lacked hops, which were only widely adopted later. Instead, brewers used herbal mixtures known as brut. These mixtures could include plants like yarrow, bog myrtle, heather, and mugwort. Some of these herbs enhanced intoxication, caused vivid dreams, or produced calming, sedative effects. So when a medieval peasant sat down at night with a mug of ale, they weren't just relaxing. They were slowly drifting into an altered mental state, one that felt warm, fuzzy, and detached from the harshness of the day. This was not considered drunkenness. This was normal life. Wine, especially in southern Europe and among the wealthy, carried even more layers of intoxication. Wine was rarely consumed plain. It was spiced, heated, sweetened, and infused with herbs. Medieval people believed wine carried medicinal properties, and doctors regularly prescribed it for everything from sadness to stomach pain. Some wines were infused with roots and seeds that caused light euphoria or drowsiness. Others were so strong that people reported confusion, vivid imagination, and emotional swings. Again, none of this was labeled as being high. It was simply how the body reacted to healing substances. Religion played a massive role in how intoxication was understood. If a substance caused strange sensations, visions, or emotional experiences, these weren't dismissed as chemical reactions. They were interpreted spiritually. Feeling lightheaded could mean divine presence. Vivid dreams could be messages from God. A sense of floating might be the soul drawing closer to heaven. This belief system allowed mind-altering experiences to exist openly, without shame. Medieval society didn't fear altered states. It expected them. Even children weren't excluded. Weak ale, known as small beer, was safer than water and consumed daily by all ages. While low in alcohol, constant consumption still shaped developing minds. Mild intoxication was a background hum of medieval life. What's fascinating is how unconscious all of this was. No one set out saying, "I want to get high today." Instead, they drank, ate, and medicated themselves according to tradition. The effects were accepted without question. Pain management alone introduced countless people to altered mental states. Toothaches, injuries, childbirth, infections, these were treated with herbal drinks and alcohol-based remedies. Relief often came with dizziness, warmth, blurred vision, or deep sleep. People learned to associate these sensations with healing. And because science hadn't yet separated chemistry from mystery, no one worried about dependence or long-term effects. If something worked, it worked. If it made you feel strange, that strangeness had meaning. Medieval life also involved constant communal drinking. Taverns weren't just places to get drunk, they were social centers, news hubs, and emotional shelters. Singing, storytelling, laughter, and shared intoxication created a sense of belonging in an otherwise difficult world. A tavern at night was thick with smoke, candlelight, and voices. The air smelled of ale and sweat. As mugs emptied and refilled, people slipped into looser, more open states of mind. Arguments softened. Grief was numbed. Fear faded. This was medieval escapism, not through isolation, but through shared altered experience. And yet, intoxication was rarely condemned outright. Drunkenness, yes, loss of control, violence, neglect of duty, those were sins. But mild intoxication was not only accepted, it was expected. Sobriety, by modern standards, was rare. Even monks lived this way. Monastic rules often allowed daily alcohol consumption. Some monasteries brewed incredibly strong drinks, especially during fasting periods when solid food was restricted. Liquid nourishment became liquid intoxication. The medieval body was constantly absorbing substances that shifted mood, perception, and awareness. Life itself was chemically different. Perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: medieval people did not seek escape from boredom. They sought relief from suffering. Altered states were not about fun, they were about endurance. In a world with no anesthesia, no antidepressants, and no real painkillers, intoxication filled the gap. It softened reality just enough to make life bearable. So when we ask what getting high was like in medieval times, the answer is unexpected. It wasn't a secret rebellion. It wasn't a subculture. It was everyday existence. People lived slightly altered, slightly numbed, slightly comforted, guided by tradition, belief, and necessity. The medieval mind floated gently between sobriety and intoxication, never fully one or the other. And this was only the beginning. Because beyond alcohol lay plants, potions, and practices that pushed the human mind far beyond anything a mug of ale could do. And that's where the story truly begins. Long before laboratories, prescriptions, or warning labels, medieval people turned to the natural world for relief, healing, and sometimes escape. Forests, fields, and gardens were not just sources of food, they were living pharmacies. Every leaf, root, and seed carried potential power, and some of that power reached deep into the human mind. What makes this period so fascinating is that many medieval people experienced powerful psychoactive effects without ever realizing they were getting high. To them, these sensations were simply part of medicine, faith, and folklore. Herbal knowledge was everywhere. It was passed down orally, often by women, midwives, healers, and wise folk who learned through experience rather than books. These individuals knew which plants soothed pain, which calmed anxiety, and which brought sleep. But many of these same plants also altered perception, mood, and consciousness in ways that modern science now recognizes as hallucinogenic or narcotic. One of the most infamous plants of the medieval world was henbane. It grew easily in poor soil and was used widely as a painkiller and sedative. In small doses, henbane reduced pain and anxiety. In slightly larger doses, it caused confusion, euphoria, vivid dreams, and hallucinations. People described strange visions, voices, and a sense of detachment from their bodies. Taken just a little too far, it could lead to madness or death. Yet henbane wasn't feared, it was trusted. Doctors prescribed it. Healers relied on it. Its effects were interpreted through belief, not biology. If someone experienced visions after taking henbane, those visions were meaningful. They might be divine warnings, spiritual journeys, or messages from unseen forces. Mandrake was even more powerful and far more mysterious. Its human-shaped root fascinated medieval people, who believed it possessed a soul. Legends claimed that mandrake screamed when pulled from the earth, killing anyone who heard it. Rituals were invented to harvest it safely, tying a dog to the plant, covering one's ears, or pulling it out at night. Mandrake was used as an anesthetic during surgery and childbirth. It dulled pain and induced deep sleep. But it also caused intense hallucinations, feelings of flying, and vivid, dreamlike states. People reported seeing spirits, traveling to other worlds, or leaving their bodies entirely. Today, we would recognize this as a powerful psychoactive experience. In the Middle Ages, it was seen as crossing into another realm. The line between medicine and magic disappeared completely. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was another commonly used plant. It was used cosmetically to dilate pupils, creating a look considered beautiful at the time. But internally, belladonna caused euphoria, confusion, hallucinations, and loss of time perception. Women using it for beauty may have experienced altered states without realizing the cause. Then there was mugwort, a plant closely associated with dreams. It was added to beers, burned as incense, or placed under pillows to encourage vivid dreaming. People believed mugwort opened the mind to visions and prophetic dreams. Monks, travelers, and villagers all used it in different ways, often describing intense dream experiences that felt more real than waking life. Dreams mattered deeply in medieval society. They were not dismissed as imagination. They were messages. So when plants intensified dreams, they were welcomed, not feared. These herbal experiences didn't happen in isolation. They were woven into daily life. A woman in labor might be given a potion that eased pain but also caused visions. A sick man might drink a herbal brew that calmed his body while making him feel detached and floating. An anxious traveler might chew a root that relaxed him and blurred his senses. None of this was framed as intoxication. It was framed as treatment. What's striking is how little control existed over dosage. Without standardized measurements, the difference between relief and overwhelming hallucination was razor thin. Two people could take the same remedy and have completely different experiences. One might feel calm and sleepy. Another might see visions, hear voices, or lose touch with reality for hours. This unpredictability shaped medieval belief systems. If effects varied so wildly, they couldn't be purely physical. There had to be spiritual reasons. God's will. Personal sin. Demonic interference. Fate. This is where fears slowly entered the picture. As Christianity tightened its grip on Europe, experiences that couldn't be explained or controlled became suspicious. Herbal knowledge, especially knowledge held by women, was increasingly associated with witchcraft. The same plants once praised for healing were now accused of opening doors to the devil. People who experienced hallucinations after herbal remedies might confess to seeing demons. Women who knew how to prepare potent potions were accused of flying at night or attending secret gatherings. What we might recognize today as drug-induced visions were reinterpreted as evidence of evil. Ironically, these accusations often arose because the substances worked too well. Flying ointments, a mixture of fats and psychoactive plants, were rumored to allow witches to fly. In reality, these ointments likely caused intense hallucinations and sensations of flight when absorbed through the skin. Users genuinely felt as though they were soaring through the air. To medieval authorities, this wasn't chemistry, it was proof of sorcery. And yet, despite fear and persecution, people continued to rely on these substances. Pain was real. Fear was constant. Death was near. Altering the mind offered relief that prayer alone could not. Even monasteries, supposedly places of strict control, used herbal remedies extensively. Monks documented plants, experimented with mixtures, and quietly experienced altered states under the banner of healing. Some described moments of deep peace, vivid imagery during prayer, or emotional intensity that blurred the line between spiritual devotion and intoxication. The medieval world didn't have the language to separate these experiences. Altered states were not questioned, they were interpreted. What makes this period so haunting is how normalized it all was. People didn't seek extreme experiences. They stumbled into them. A drink for pain. A herb for sleep. A root for calm. And suddenly, reality shifted. Time slowed. Colors sharpened. Dreams bled into waking life. These experiences shaped medieval culture deeply. Art, religious visions, folklore, and superstition all carry traces of altered perception. Saints reported visions. Peasants told stories of spirits in the woods. Travelers spoke of otherworldly encounters. Not all of these were imagined. Many were chemically induced, experienced by people who had no concept of drugs as we understand them today. Getting high in medieval times wasn't rebellion. It wasn't leisure. It was survival mixed with belief. People trusted nature completely, even when nature led them into terrifying or transcendent states of mind. And as herbal knowledge became feared, controlled, and eventually suppressed, something else happened. These experiences didn't disappear. They went underground, and in doing so, they set the stage for the next chapter of this story, where intoxication becomes ritual, secrecy, and power. Because once the mind learns it can escape, it never forgets. While peasants drank ale in taverns and healers brewed potions in cottages, another group quietly mastered the art of intoxication in a very controlled environment. Behind thick stone walls, under vows of discipline and prayer, medieval monks were producing some of the most powerful mind-altering substances of their time. Monasteries were not just religious centers. They were laboratories, breweries, and hubs of knowledge where intoxication was carefully shaped, justified, and sanctified. Monks brewed alcohol not for indulgence, but for survival. Clean water was unreliable, and fasting rules restricted solid food for long periods. Liquid nourishment became essential. Beer, wine, and mead provided calories, warmth, and comfort. Over time, monastic brewing grew more advanced than anything found in villages. But these drinks were far from mild. Medieval monastic beer was thick, cloudy, and heavy. It was often closer to liquid bread than modern beer. Grains were poorly filtered, fermentation was uncontrolled, and alcohol content could rise unpredictably. During fasting seasons, monks were sometimes allowed to drink several liters per day. The result was a steady, low-level intoxication that blurred the line between devotion and chemical calm. Mead was even more powerful. Made from fermented honey, it carried natural sugars that encouraged strong fermentation. Honey itself had symbolic value, associated with purity and divine blessing. Drinking mead felt less like indulgence and more like communion with nature and God. Yet its effects were undeniable. Heavy mead consumption led to dizziness, emotional warmth, slowed thinking, and dreamlike states that lingered long after prayers ended. Wine, especially in southern monasteries, was treated as both sacrament and medicine. Monks believed wine strengthened the body and lifted the spirit. It was often heated, spiced, and infused with herbs believed to promote health. In reality, many of these herbs intensified intoxication. Wormwood, for example, was commonly used in medicinal wines. It stimulated digestion but also caused altered mental states, especially when combined with alcohol. Mugwort enhanced dreams and emotional sensitivity. Other additives calmed anxiety or induced drowsiness. Monks consumed these drinks daily, sometimes without realizing how deeply they affected mood and perception. The monastery schedule amplified these effects. Long hours of prayer, silence, chanting, and candlelight already altered consciousness. Add alcohol into the mix, and the mind became highly suggestible. Emotional responses deepened. Visions during prayer became more vivid. A sense of closeness to God intensified. To the monks, this wasn't intoxication, it was spiritual clarity. Some recorded moments of overwhelming peace, radiant light, or voices heard during meditation. These experiences were documented carefully, often described as divine gifts. But modern understanding suggests many of these moments occurred in minds gently altered by consistent alcohol and herbal intake. Monasteries also functioned as centers of herbal knowledge. Monks grew medicinal plants in enclosed gardens. They recorded recipes, tested remedies, and refined mixtures over generations. While their intent was healing, the side effects were often psychoactive. Sleep aids induced deep, dream-filled rest. Pain treatments caused numbness and mental detachment. Calming potions softened fear and anxiety. A monk suffering from stress, illness, or doubt might quietly experience altered states without ever questioning their origin. And then there were the fasting periods. During long fasts, food was restricted, but liquids were allowed. The body, weakened by lack of solid nourishment, became more sensitive to alcohol. Even small amounts produced stronger effects. Dizziness, lightheadedness, and emotional vulnerability increased. In these conditions, monks described intense spiritual experiences. They felt tested, purified, elevated. Hunger and intoxication combined into powerful, altered states. Outside monastery walls, these drinks circulated widely. Monks sold surplus beer and wine to towns and villages. Their reputation for quality made monastic brews highly desirable. Ordinary people drinking monastery-made alcohol unknowingly consumed stronger, more complex mixtures than typical village brews. A farmer might feel unusually euphoric. A traveler might experience vivid dreams. A grieving widow might feel sudden emotional release. None of them would blame the drink. They would blame fate, God, or their own souls. This quiet spread of monastic intoxication shaped medieval society in subtle ways. Alcohol became associated not just with pleasure, but with authority and trust. If monks made it, it must be safe. If it caused strange feelings, those feelings must be meaningful. Yet moderation was preached constantly. Drunkenness was a sin. Loss of control threatened discipline. Monastic rules carefully balanced allowance and restriction. Intoxication was permitted only as long as it didn't disrupt order. But human bodies don't follow rules. Some monks drank too much. Some became dependent. Records mention disciplinary actions for excessive drinking, though the line between acceptable and excessive was blurry. When intoxication became visible, slurred speech, unsteady walking, it was condemned. When it remained quiet and internal, it was tolerated. This duality defined medieval intoxication. Altered states were allowed as long as they served a purpose: endurance, devotion, healing. The monastery itself was an altered environment. Stone walls muffled sound. Repetitive chanting lulled the mind. Time blurred. Days followed strict rhythms. In such conditions, even mild intoxication had amplified effects. A monk sitting in a dim chapel, slightly buzzed, chanting softly, surrounded by incense smoke and candlelight, was already far from ordinary consciousness. To him, the sensations felt sacred. What's remarkable is how openly this was accepted. There was no concept of sobriety as moral purity. Instead, self-control mattered. Feeling altered was fine. Losing oneself was not. Outside the monastery, the same logic applied. Taverns echoed monastic rhythms in a distorted way: communal drinking, shared stories, emotional release. The difference was intention, not effect. Monks sought closeness to God. Peasants sought relief from life. Both altered their minds through the same means. And slowly, as centuries passed, monastic brewing grew more regulated. Recipes standardized. Hops were introduced, stabilizing beer and reducing some herbal effects. Intoxication became more predictable, less mysterious. But during the heart of the medieval period, monasteries stood at the center of a quiet truth. The most disciplined, devout men of the age were also among its most consistent consumers of mind-altering substances. They simply called it nourishment. They called it medicine. They called it faith. And in doing so, they preserved a culture where altered consciousness was not feared, but woven into the very structure of daily life. In medieval times, battle was chaos, fear, and noise beyond imagination. There were no anesthetics, no trauma counseling, and no guarantees of survival. A soldier stepping onto a battlefield faced pain, screams, blood, and death at arm's length. To face that reality, warriors across medieval Europe and beyond often turned to one powerful tool, altering the mind before the fighting even began. Fear was the greatest enemy. A shaking hand could mean death. Hesitation could mean defeat. So medieval warriors sought ways to dull fear, sharpen aggression, and detach themselves from pain. Alcohol was the most common solution. Before battles, soldiers drank heavily. Wine, ale, and mead flowed freely, not as celebration, but as preparation. Alcohol numbed anxiety and reduced hesitation. It created courage where none existed. It made men louder, bolder, and more willing to charge forward. Even commanders encouraged drinking before combat, believing it raised morale and strengthened resolve. But alcohol was only the beginning. In the colder regions of Europe, especially among Norse warriors, there were stories of fighters entering battle in a trance-like rage. These warriors, often called berserkers, were said to feel no pain, show no fear, and fight with terrifying intensity. They screamed, bit their shields, and charged enemies without armor. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as exaggeration or myth. But modern research suggests something far more unsettling. Many historians believe these warriors consumed psychoactive substances before battle, possibly certain mushrooms or herbal mixtures that altered perception and induced aggressive, dissociative states. Under these effects, pain dulled. Fear disappeared. Time slowed. Fighters felt unstoppable, disconnected from their bodies, driven by pure instinct. Injuries that would normally cripple a man went unnoticed until the battle ended. To medieval observers, this behavior looked supernatural. Warriors appeared possessed, inhuman, protected by the gods. In reality, they were experiencing powerful chemical changes in the brain. This wasn't limited to Vikings. Across medieval cultures, ritual intoxication before combat existed in different forms. Some soldiers chewed roots believed to strengthen courage. Others drank herbal wines meant to calm nerves or invoke divine protection. These preparations were often accompanied by prayers, chants, or rituals that further heightened mental focus. The combination was potent. Ritual, belief, and substance worked together to create altered states ideal for violence. Once battle began, these effects could mean survival, or disaster. An intoxicated warrior might fight fiercely but recklessly. Judgment suffered. Coordination faltered. Victories were sometimes won through sheer aggression rather than strategy. And when the fighting ended, the consequences arrived. Soldiers came down from these altered states into pain, shock, and trauma. Wounds became visible. Fear returned. Many turned again to alcohol to numb both physical injury and psychological scars. Medieval society had no concept of post-traumatic stress. Nightmares, emotional numbness, and violent outbursts were common among veterans. Drinking became a coping mechanism. Taverns near garrisons filled with men trying to silence memories. This cycle, intoxication before battle, trauma afterward, and continued drinking, created generations of warriors living in altered mental states long after the fighting ended. Religion again shaped how this was understood. A warrior's courage was seen as God-given. Fearlessness was a sign of divine favor. If substances helped achieve that fearlessness, they were rarely questioned. Even knights, bound by codes of honor and discipline, drank heavily. Before tournaments and wars, wine was consumed openly. It loosened tension, built confidence, and dulled anticipation of injury. Pain management during battle was crude and brutal. Afterward, herbal poultices mixed with alcohol were applied to wounds. These treatments numbed pain but also clouded the mind. Injured soldiers drifted in and out of awareness, experiencing strange dreams, hallucinations, and emotional swings. Many believed these visions were messages, warnings, punishments, or signs of survival. In truth, they were minds struggling to process trauma while under the influence of intoxicants. War camps themselves were environments ripe for altered consciousness. Exhaustion, hunger, fear, and constant drinking combined to distort reality. Days blurred together. Moral boundaries weakened. Violence felt normal. For some, this became addictive. A soldier who learned to fight without fear while intoxicated struggled to feel normal without it. Peace became unbearable. Sobriety brought memories too sharp to endure. And so intoxication followed warriors home. In medieval towns, former soldiers filled taverns. Their stories were loud, exaggerated, and often violent. Drinking kept their past at a distance. Society tolerated this behavior, understanding it as the price of survival. No one spoke of addiction. No one spoke of trauma. They spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and fate. What's haunting is how normalized all of this was. Altering the mind for war wasn't controversial, it was practical. A frightened soldier was a liability. An altered one was effective. Getting high before battle wasn't about pleasure. It was about becoming something else, something less human, less afraid, less vulnerable. In that sense, medieval warfare demanded intoxication. Not chemically advanced, not refined, but deeply embedded in the culture of survival. And when the swords were laid down and armor removed, the altered states lingered. Because once a mind learns how to escape fear, it rarely forgets the path. And in the medieval world, that path was paved with drink, ritual, belief, and desperation, long before anyone understood the true cost of leaving reality behind. As the medieval world slowly moved toward the early modern age, something changed. What had once been normal, accepted, and woven quietly into daily life began to feel dangerous. Altered states of mind, once understood as healing, spiritual, or necessary, were increasingly viewed through the lens of fear and control. Getting high, though never called that, was no longer innocent. The Church, which had long tolerated moderate intoxication, began tightening its grip. Excess was condemned more harshly. Strange visions, trances, and emotional outbursts were no longer interpreted generously. Instead of divine messages, they were labeled temptations, weakness, or outright sin. Herbal knowledge suffered the most. Plants that had eased pain for centuries were suddenly suspicious. Remedies that caused dreams or visions were no longer seen as gifts from God, but as doors to evil. Midwives and healers, often women, found themselves accused of witchcraft. The same potions that once saved lives were now evidence of corruption. This shift wasn't sudden, but it was relentless. Authorities wanted order, predictability, control. Altered minds were unpredictable, and unpredictability threatened power. If people could experience visions, ecstasy, or escape without church or state, that was dangerous. And so the narrative changed. Flying ointments, herbal brews, and dream-inducing plants were no longer medicine. They were tools of the devil. Confessions extracted under torture described sensations of flying, leaving the body, or traveling to secret gatherings. Modern science recognizes these descriptions as classic effects of psychoactive substances, but medieval courts saw proof of evil. Fear replaced curiosity. Knowledge went underground. Recipes were hidden or destroyed. Oral traditions were silenced through violence. Yet intoxication didn't disappear. Alcohol remained deeply embedded in society. Taverns multiplied. Drinking became more regulated, taxed, and controlled. Instead of unpredictable herbal brews, standardized alcohol rose in dominance. This shift didn't eliminate altered states, it simplified them. People still sought escape. But now it came with shame. Drunkenness became a moral failure, not a communal experience. The line between acceptable and sinful grew sharper. Sobriety gained religious importance, even as alcohol consumption remained high. This contradiction defined the end of the medieval relationship with intoxication. At the same time, early medical thinkers began separating medicine from mysticism. Herbal remedies were studied, categorized, and stripped of spiritual meaning. Effects once described as visions were reclassified as symptoms. Slowly, the language of science replaced the language of belief. But the experience stayed the same. People still felt euphoria, numbness, fearlessness, and detachment. They just explained it differently. What makes this transition so important is what was lost. Medieval society accepted altered consciousness as part of being human. Pain, fear, and escape existed openly. When control tightened, those needs didn't vanish, they became hidden. This secrecy laid the groundwork for modern drug culture. Once substances were forbidden, they became powerful. Once experiences were condemned, they became rebellious. What had been survival turned into transgression. And yet, traces of the medieval mindset remained. We still drink to forget. We still medicate pain. We still search for meaning in altered states. The difference is that we now understand the chemistry, but struggle just as much with the consequences. Looking back, medieval people weren't ignorant. They were navigating a brutal world with the tools they had. Plants, fermentation, ritual, and belief helped them endure suffering we can barely imagine. They didn't chase pleasure. They chased relief. So when we ask what getting high was like in medieval times, the answer isn't shocking, it's human. It was messy, dangerous, spiritual, and deeply woven into survival. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this. The desire to escape reality isn't modern. It's ancient. And it has always walked hand in hand with fear, faith, and the fragile hope that tomorrow might hurt a little less. If you've made it this far, thank you for journeying into the shadowed corners of history with me. If you enjoy calm, immersive stories that reveal the hidden side of the past, consider subscribing and letting these quiet histories guide you into curiosity, and maybe even rest, once again.